I want to put my cards firmly on the table because, first of all, I'm in Istanbul and have been for a couple of weeks now, and I fell and hurt my shoulder. A local doctor in a local hospital has said that I've probably broken my neck, and I need to be very careful. So I'm trying to take it easy, and I'm waiting for various scans and for treatment, and we'll see where we go from there. Actually, I'm feeling significantly better for the first time in 2 or 3 weeks, two weeks or so, and I've got a lot more rest today than usual. And I thought it would be useful to look at the İmamoğlu situation as dispassionately as possible. When the news broke, and again, I'm certainly not in the camp that disapproves of President Erdogan. I think he's done an extraordinary job in the last 22 years, and I marvel particularly at the architectural innovations around the country. And then I look at the stuff which has been put up and promoted by the CHP party, and it's looking at a world which is from the past, and that I find very strange. When the news broke of the Istanbul leader of the municipality, Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrest on corruption charges, international coverage like that of the BBC leapt into an all too familiar framing. Another act, they said, in Erdogan's theatre of authoritarianism. But what has followed is not, as some suggested, widespread rioting, nor has it been a straightforward popular revolt. What I'm seeing in Turkey is far more complex. A convergence of judicial activity, political activism, international ambivalence, a growing crisis in democratic credibility, fomented not least by outside actors, often people returning to Turkey and stirring up anger here. Firstly, the fact is that there isn't widespread rioting, as described repeatedly by the BBC from the very beginning. And secondly, the reports focused from the beginning on the supposed power struggle between Erdogan and his suppression of freedom and of opposition leaders, a little bit like the reports about Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny was not the opposition, and İmamoğlu is not the opposition. And this supposed power struggle by Erdogan and his suppression of freedom, rather than the serious allegations and the televised imagery of fraud, which surely merits investigation and condemnation, shows a bias which I think is irresponsible of the BBC. This dual failure, both of narrative and of accountability, lies at the heart of the issue. İmamoğlu's arrest was ostensibly grounded in allegations of nylon fatura. That's a nylon invoice. That is a fake invoice issued by the seller, showing that a commercial transaction actually exists, but these invoices are used to evade tax or obtain unfair tax refunds. The CHP party in Istanbul, for example, and this came to light today, and again it's not appearing anywhere on international news. The CHP party in Istanbul ordered, apparently, allegedly, 95 million Turkish liras worth, that's about £2 million worth of baklava, from a shanty shop in Barish Market in Muş. That's in the centre of Turkey. It's the next county, it's the next area going west from Van, and within reach of Mount Ararat. And this is what the shop looks like. It's a shanty shop. This is fake invoicing. And fake invoicing is an endemic problem in Turkey's informal economy, much like fake diplomas and fake university degrees. And the practices are diverse and inventive, often looking authentic and genuine. So It's a complex struggle to disentangle the genuine from the deliberately dodgy, and of course, even the most upright people can get caught in this web of complex paperwork. Is that what's happened in the İmamoğlu case? Who knows, because the interpretation about a power struggle has already been projected onto the investigation by journalists from, for example, the BBC and other newspapers in the West, and this has confused the real story. The practice of manipulating documentation is so widespread, it's socially accepted even, but it's no less criminal for being quotidian. But to add to the problem, there's this consistency in prosecution. So, for example, former AK officials like Mele Gocek have faced dozens of complaints involving billions of lira, and yet they've been untouched. Here, as elsewhere across Europe, the law is applied selectively. And that, I think, is probably the biggest issue to come out of this crisis. Added to this mix is the issue of immunity for elected officials, and particularly for MPs in Turkey, in Ankara. So Erdogan wants that tradition of immunity swept away. And in fact, the law has already been made to stop the immunity, but it's something that the opposition party, the CHP party, have consistently resisted. The question has to be whether that resistance is because the party is more riddled with corruption, or whether there is a real purpose to elected immunity. I think it's a critical question. Legal immunity can serve as a bulwark against politically motivated prosecution, but equally it can shield the corrupt from scrutiny. And my instinct is that immunity is absurd. With high office comes higher responsibility. And in the language of pop culture jurisprudence, in the language of Gen Z, with great power comes great responsibility, but whether Spider-Man has a haircut or not. But if power involves or implies responsibility, it also demands transparency. And the arrest of the BBC correspondent Mark Lowen, for example, who was covering the protests in Istanbul, reveals just how nervous the system has become here. To detain a journalist of this calibre for reporting, for doing his job, and deport him and keep him in a police, questioned in a police station for being a threat to public order is an affront not only to press freedom, but to the international order that Erdogan respects and that his longevity represents. And I'm afraid he's surrounded by people who think that they can they can act aggressively like this because he will be pleased. This suppression is not limited to the streets of Istanbul. It extends through Turkey's digital and media architecture. Trying to function on the internet at the moment is a nightmare. The opposition aligned Sucu TV faces a 10-day broadcast ban for, quote, inciting hatred and hostility. It's a euphemism for airing dissent. And meanwhile, social media accounts critical of Erdogan have been completely blocked. And Elon Musk has connived in that process, even as protest slogans like Hak, Hukuk, Adalet, rights, law, justice, echo through Turkey's urban centres. But I have heard nothing, and I am here. Hello, this is Thursday evening, and you can hear this noise of people banging things outside the house, and I don't see anybody, but I certainly hear this banging, and this is the equivalent, this is in Turkey, this is the equivalent of clapping for the NHS. This is banging for İmamoğlu, and I wouldn't have called this a disruptive protest in any way. In fact, rather like clapping for the NHS, it borders on the charming. And what I think is so disturbing about the reporting by the BBC is the assumption, is the failure to look into the reasons for İmamoğlu's arrest and detention, simply assuming that this is some sort of squabble for authority in Turkey, and it fails to consider that İmamoğlu is that Erdogan is not standing in 2 years' time. We're coming to the end of Erdogan's time in power, 22 years, I think. What's particularly telling is that Turkey's diaspora communities are reacting, especially in Germany. There's a belief that in many expat Turkish communities that Erdogan brings order. But in Essen, for example, the CHP branch is swelling with second-generation activists. And some have even travelled back to Turkey to join protests, some of them coming to Turkey for the first time, willingly risking arrest. And one young CHP member said, "We have crossed that line, we are no longer afraid." And that phrase, "we are no longer afraid," is a political tipping point. It echoes the Gezi Park protests of 2013, which began with environmental concerns, but morphed into a reckoning with authoritarianism. Today's protests are more direct. They centre around political prosecution and electoral interference. But like Gezi, they are decentralised, youthful, and persistent. Now, Erdogan's defenders argue that the arrest of İmamoğlu is not political but judicial, and that the case must proceed on its merits. But the timing, his removal from office just as he was being named the CHP candidate for the 2028 presidency, makes these claims look questionable, even implausible. The judiciary in Turkey, increasingly purged and politicised since the 2016 coup attempt, the opposition says lacks the independence to convince even Erdogan's international allies about its neutrality. In other words, this is about optics, not oppression. But what of the international response? Tepid at best. Europe, anxious to retain Turkey's cooperation on migration and defence, offers only muted rebukes. The US, under Trump, has praised Erdogan and declared the crisis a domestic issue, despite the profound global implications. The irony, of course, is that Erdogan wants to re-enter the US arms market even as he closes down a serious dispute at home. So where does this leave Turkey? The country teeters on the edge between serious progress and allegations of autocracy. With 3 years to the next election, Erdogan may be calculating the economy may recover, the protests may burn out, and with the opposition fragmented, there is room to rewrite the script. But this interpretation overlooks the simple fact that Erdogan is not running in 2028. And the costs to all this are visible. The Istanbul Stock Exchange has fallen, confidence in the rule of law has plummeted, and protesters, many of them young, urban, and previously apolitical, are running around the streets, if you believe the international media. But more than that, the international media itself have questioned the integrity of the government. And I think it's vital that we resist the simplistic narratives that are being peddled on organisations like the BBC. I remember years and years ago being in Oxford when Mrs. Thatcher arrived for the unveiling of a bust in Somerville College. And that wasn't a Julie Andrews moment. It was this was a marble bust which had been created in her honour, and she was going to unveil it. And she arrived in a car, the prime ministerial car, and it turned into Somerville. And I was very close. My college was just down the road, and I went to observe. And what I found was a cheering, supportive crowd, and there was a pocket of about 3 or 4 feet of protesters with signs and stuff in one corner. And that was all that was broadcast on the news channels, because that was the drama. The larger crowd, which was supportive and enthusiastic, or muted, didn't feature at all in press reports. And the cameras which got closer to the protesters, of course, picked up this din of protest. I don't imagine that Thatcher in the car even noticed that they were there. And this is how reporting can skew the narrative. So I think the arrest of İmamoğlu is not merely another episode in Erdogan's power struggle. It is rather the way this country negotiates the move from legal immunity to proper responsibility. It's about the role of protests in a country that has a living memory of a near catastrophic political coup. It's about the role of journalism. It's about the opportunity for opposition figures to stand for election without fear of arrest. And if Turkey is to avoid sliding irrevocably into chaos, autocracy and dissent, the message from its people and the world needs to be clearer. Power is temporary, but justice and the institutions that serve justice must endure.